Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, I discuss, even though that I was born and grew up Jewish, when I made the decision to be Jewish, and why I actively choose to practice my Judaism today. Let's get started. Growing up, I was raised in a Jewish home with many Jewish rituals and practices. My mother lit her Shabbat candles weekly. We went to synagogue on the high holidays, and I even went to an after-school Hebrew school. I am sure that I'm not the only Jewish kid who is upset that 2 weekday evenings and 1 Sunday a week I'd be stuck in another classroom having to learn some foreign language and things that had little bearing on my life. I would want nothing more than to hang out with my friends and be out in the sun. I wonder if this unhappiness of having to miss out on evenings and weekends with my friends caused me to have no interest in listening or learning Hebrew in school. Despite this, at my parents' demand, I had a bar mitzvah and officially became a member of the history of the Jewish people, only to essentially give up on it altogether. The unwritten but somewhat understood agreement with my parents seemed to be that once I hit my bar mitzvah, I was able to make the choice if I wanted to go to synagogue or participate in the non-cultural and religious practices of Judaism. This choice to not participate fully in Judaism, I think, is one of the biggest regrets of my life. Unfortunately, I feel like I've missed out on learning so many things that are important about our history and culture. It became so much harder to try and learn these things, including the strange language of Hebrew, at an older age. The day that this all changed was when I first applied back in the early 2000s to go on the Taglit birthright trip, somewhat against my will. For more information on this, check out my podcast, My Experience with Taglit Birthright Israel. I remember going for my interview with the birthright team and being asked questions about my Jewish practice. These were things like my Hebrew name, my parents' Hebrew names, and what synagogue I belonged to. My quick responses to these answers apparently shocked the interviewer. I recall vividly that they responded with, "Wow, you're pretty Jewish." I guess that was in comparison to some of the other people that they speak to on a daily basis. This was the first time I'd ever thought of myself as, quote, pretty Jewish, because I did very little in terms of Jewish practice. I also realized that even though I felt like I was somewhat non-observant, apparently there were people who were much less observant than I was. People who did not have bar mitzvahs and did not know their own or their parents' Hebrew names. This wasn't uncommon. Birthright, unbeknownst to me at the time, would change my life and led me down a path to try and relearn all the things that I had suppressed from Hebrew school. The history of Jewish culture is interesting and unique. We think back to the diaspora Jewish communities in Europe. We saw the rise of the shtetl culture. These shtetls, or Jewish towns, were very insular and isolated from the regular societies that they were found in. Sometimes this was by choice, as a way to ensure support and access to Jewish community needs. This would be things like synagogues and kosher food. Other times, unfortunately, it was forced on the Jewish communities, who were unable to leave their towns. It was not until around the time of the Haskalah, or Enlightenment, in Europe, around the late 1700s, that the Jews joined the European idea of Reformation and Enlightenment when it came to religion and philosophy. Many Jewish people who lived in these towns because there was no work or life opportunities outside of the Jewish towns found themselves for once with opportunities outside of those Jewish communities. Jews were able to join popular culture, shave off their traditional beards, lose their Jewish-sounding names, and blend in with the rest of the country. This would also have included tossing aside some of the traditional practices of eating kosher, wearing traditional clothes, and maintaining these traditional beards. Many Jews aimed to look, sound, and act completely the same as their Christian neighbors. For the first time, the Jewish communities were no longer forced to live, eat, and act in a specific way, and even more importantly, the main tool that was used to keep these people in line, fear of expulsion from their community, was no longer a concern. Jews could happily live their life without connection to the Jewish communities of old. This hasn't changed much to the present day. Here I was, a Jewish adult in the 21st century living in Canada, with every right and freedom to practice my religion freely, but I was actively choosing not to. This all took a major change when I was given a copy of a book written by a fairly distant cousin from Israel. She had written a book based on her experience immigrating to Israel in the 1980s, juxtaposed to the immigration experience of our mutual family member, my great-aunt, as a pioneer who left Europe as a young Jewish girl to become a Zionist pioneer, someone who worked the land and created a state in the 1930s. It was in this book that I first came face to face with my own family's history. According to this book, my grandfather Yosef, who was a merchant and sold milk to Jews and non-Jews in the area, hears rumors amongst the local residents that the Nazis were coming to the area where they lived, a town called Yasinya on the Hungarian border, apparently a city now in modern-day Ukraine. When the community began to speak about the impending doom, a non-Jewish neighbor and customer of Yosef's came to him and asked him if he would bring his family to their house in order to hide from the Nazis. According to this book that was written using survivor testimony, Yosef chose not to hide in a non-Jewish home because he suggested that he would rather die as a Jew than live as an animal. He had great concerns about the idea of living in a non-Jewish household and not being able to keep the Jewish kosher laws. This was eye-opening for me as I read this. Here I was, a Jewish person with every opportunity to practice my Judaism, keeping kosher, lighting Shabbos candles, and much more, but I'm choosing not to. When Yosef, the man whom my Hebrew name is taken from, went to his death in Auschwitz for his beliefs. From that day forward, I decided to make a change. I was going to be a proud Jew in honor of my family who died trying to practice the same faith. What is most incredible to think about is the fact that the Shabbos candles that my wife and I light each week ties us through our ancestors generations ago. These traditions and customs have survived countless pogroms, attacks, and attempted genocides. It may be the very reason why Jews, despite all odds, have been able to remain connected to their spiritual center and their beliefs. Now, choosing to attend synagogue every Shabbat, I find myself angry with the younger me for not appreciating the incredible religion that has been passed down to me. I have realized only in my older age how much I wish that I would have listened in Hebrew school all of those years ago. How much more learning could I have had I chosen not to run from my Jewish heritage? In the end, being Jewish in many ways is a calling. It calls to us from an ancient past where our grandmothers and grandfathers said the same words that we say every Friday night. Such a small thing like lighting Shabbat candles can be so insignificant to our day-to-day lives, but be so meaningful to stand in the spot of your great-great-great-grandparents and their relatives. Yes, of course someone can be Jewish by birth and by culture, but even that is something that has to be actively chosen every day. To be a proud, strong, openly Jewish person, one needs to make that choice every morning when they wake up. It is a tremendous responsibility, but it is also a tremendous blessing and gift. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other podcasts on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.